Please subscribe to hear more Cryptid Tales. If you like the story you heard, give us a thumbs up and feel free to leave us a comment. If you'd like to hear your own cryptid encounter on Cryptid Tales, send us an email at cryptidtalesmail@gmail.com. There wasn't much to do in the town I grew up in. Lots of lazy days, riding bikes around with my friends, and fishing down at the creek. The town was hardly a town at all. Just a small post office and a gas station. One of those places where you knew everyone and everyone was from around there. But one exceptionally hot summer, something both exciting and terrifying happened that would change the way I looked at our little town forever. Most of the area around the town was wooded, with small farms and homesteads scattered here and there, one of which belonged to a man by the name of Mr. Jefferson. I don't remember what his first name was. Around town everyone just called him Mr. Jefferson, and that's what I knew him as. Mr. Jefferson had a small farm, no bigger than a few acres, that backed up to the woods on the north end of town. He had an old milk cow and a mule, and raised a few chickens. He'd bring the eggs into town every now and then and sell them out of the back of his pickup at the gas station. As I mentioned previously, that summer was a hot one. A real scorcher most days, and me and my friends spent a lot of our free time hanging out at the gas station, washing people's windshields or checking their oil, in exchange for whatever change they cared to give us so we could buy cold soda pops and candy. The gas station was the heart of the town, and that was where you got your local news. If someone had something to tell, that's where they went to tell it. And as a kid, I was all ears when the grown-ups were peddling their gossip. One day, Mr. Jefferson was talking to a man who had just bought some eggs off of him, telling him that something had killed a couple of his chickens the night before. Mr. Jefferson seemed much more upset at the telling of his news than the man seemed to be about hearing it. But that was to be expected, considering the situation. The next day, me and my buddy Clay rode our bikes by the gas station on our way to do some swimming down at the creek. It was a Sunday, and surprisingly, Mr. Jefferson was not in the parking lot selling eggs. I couldn't remember a time when Mr. Jefferson wasn't sitting in the parking lot on a Sunday. He'd have some old egg cartons sitting on his tailgate filled with multicolored eggs, and his faded, hand-painted sign that read eggs for sale with the number 4 in place of the word. But that Sunday, he wasn't there. I guess it was around noon that day. I was back at the gas station spending the last of my change on a bottle of orange knee-high or something similar, I imagine. They had an old booth from a diner inside the gas station, and with my soda and the fan they had going, the heat was almost tolerable. I was sitting in the booth, staring out the window, when I saw Mr. Jefferson's truck coming down the road. Coming to sell some eggs to make up for yesterday, I thought to myself. So you can imagine my surprise when he whipped into the parking lot and pulled right up front instead of pulling in over in his usual spot by the road. He slid out of the truck, wiping the sweat off his face with an old red bandana, and shuffled into the store. We made eye contact as he walked in, and I'll never forget that look he had on his face. Almost like he was real nervous or something. Like he had just robbed a bank and I was a police officer. I quickly shifted my eyes to looking back out the window. Leroy, the gas station owner, greeted him and asked him where he was the day before, mentioning several people had inquired after finding out they wouldn't be purchasing any eggs that day. I don't think there was a sudden rush for Mr. Jefferson's eggs. I think it was more about the gossip of why he hadn't been there. I strained my ears to make out what they were saying over the noise of the whirring box fan. Well, I caught the thing that was killing my chickens, Mr. Jefferson said before leaning towards Leroy behind the counter and lowering his voice a bit. I couldn't hear everything he said, but I swore I heard the word creature. And by the sudden change in expression on Leroy's face, I had heard correctly. Shortly after a brief back-and-forth exchange, Mr. Jefferson scurried back to his truck and took off out of the parking lot, spitting gravel as he went. Leroy walked out from behind the counter and approached me with a look of bewilderment on his face. "Your granddad at home?" he asked me from behind his thick black-rimmed glasses. "Yes, sir," I replied back between gulps of my soda. "Why don't you run back home and fetch him? Tell him I'd like to talk to him privately if he don't mind." This wasn't really a strange request. Leroy and my grandpa had been friends their entire lives growing up together in our little town, but I knew this was something different. Something weird was going on, and I couldn't wait to find out what it was. I bet I set a new land speed record getting to my grandparents' place. The baseball cards hummed against the spokes of my bicycle wheels. Grandpa was out front pulling weeds as I came sliding into the yard. I gave him the message from Leroy, shrugging my shoulders when he asked if I knew what it was about. I threw my bike in the back of his pickup and hopped in the passenger side. When we got to the gas station, he made me wait in the truck as he went inside to talk to Leroy. What seemed like forever passed before Grandpa came back out and got in the truck. Leroy followed, turning the open sign around to "Sorry, we're closed," and locked the door. "What's going on?" I asked, now noticing the puzzled wrinkles on Grandpa's forehead. "I'm not really sure," he muttered back. "We're going to see Mr. Jefferson." The rest of the ride out there was quiet. Leroy followed us in his old station wagon, kicking up a cloud of red dust as our caravan made its way through the backcountry roads to the Jefferson homestead. We pulled down the long drive, and Mr. Jefferson walked out and onto his front porch from inside the house. I remember his demeanor seemed so different than the usual friendly man I was used to seeing. He looked frazzled. When he saw me get out of the passenger side of Grandpa's truck, the look he gave me made it clear he didn't expect me to be with them. He walked up to my grandpa and said something under his breath, cutting his eyes back towards me. Grandpa put his hand on Jefferson's shoulder and said something back, and Jefferson seemed to accept whatever it was. Everyone made their way to the porch as Mr. Jefferson stepped inside, moments later emerging with some folding chairs for us. He leaned up against a post and began to tell us his story. I had no idea at the time what I was about to learn, what I was even about to witness. It had started about 2 weeks ago. It was the middle of the night, and the chickens started raising all kinds of heck out in their coop. Mr. Jefferson had woken up to the racket and went outside to see what was going on. The chickens seemed upset by something, but none of them were gone. The weird thing was the gate to their pen was open, and Jefferson was positive he had latched it. A few nights later, same thing happened again. Only this time there was a hen missing when he counted, and the gate was standing wide open like it was before. Jefferson said at this point that he thought a fox, or a raccoon maybe, something was definitely targeting his chickens, and he was going to put a stop to it. He didn't know how they were getting the gate open, but he changed the latch to one he was certain no varmint could get undone. All was quiet for a couple of nights, and Jefferson thought he had solved the problem. But then one night, he woke up to the sound of chickens and thrashing and the sound of some type of unholy commotion. He ran outside and found his chickens running loose all over the yard. Running out of the pen was a dark-colored creature on all fours. Jefferson said because of the size and color, he thought it was a skinny black bear, but in the dark couldn't really get a good look at it. He said it disappeared into the darkness in just a blink of an eye, and if it weren't for his coop being painted white, he probably wouldn't have seen it. He found one chicken dead and another two missing. But the thing that startled him the most was the print. On the inside of the wooden gate to the pen was a bloody print that looked like a hand. It seemed about the same size as a human, but the fingers set different and seemed too long. It just really didn't look like anything he had seen before. He thought maybe this bear he saw running out had swiped at the gate and left a smeared print that just looked like a hand. Either way, Jefferson had had enough and was putting a stop to it. He told us how he had fixed the gate back and put a key lock on it, but he didn't stop there. Jefferson had set out an old steel leg trap he had from his coyote hunting days and anchored it to the corner post on the pen. If the bear walked up to the gate on the wrong side, it was in for a bad surprise. Several nights later, Jefferson awoke to all hell breaking loose. The chickens were going off for sure, but that's not what was raising the most racket. Howls. Loud howls coming from out back. Something was caught in the trap, and it sounded to Jefferson to be a large dog. He ran out the door with a flashlight, but when he made his way to the chicken coop, what he saw froze him dead in his tracks. Mr. Jefferson stood there for a moment looking at the ground quietly. You could tell he was reliving the moment all over again in his head, and I was dying to hear the rest of the story. I looked over at Grandpa, hoping he would break the silence, and he did. "Well, what was it, Jefferson? What did you see?" "It wasn't no bear, and it wasn't a dog neither," he replied, never taking his eyes off the ground. He slowly looked up at my grandpa and then over at Leroy, and then he said with the most serious look in his eyes, "It was a monster." A chill started rising up my spine like the mercury in a thermometer. Leroy kind of chuckled and then seemed to choke on the sound when Mr. Jefferson cut his eyes at him. Grandpa just sat there. Jefferson continued, "I ain't lying, Leroy. I didn't know what the hell that thing was in my trap." He went on to describe a creature unlike anything I'd ever heard of before. He said when he got closer, he realized the thing was standing on two legs, bent over, clawing at the trap around the bottom of its leg. It was growling and whimpering as it struggled with the chain holding the trap to the pen. The creature was about 5 feet tall and covered in short black hair. Jefferson shined his flashlight at the beast, and it turned its head towards him. Jefferson said the eyes glowed in the light like two burning coals in the fireplace, and the thing had a face like a wolf, with its ears pressed back on its head as it curled its lips and snarled at him. If so much as a mosquito had landed on me at that point, I would have jumped right out of my skin. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mr. Jefferson was a well-respected man in our town and known as being honest, but what he was saying? The story he was telling us was unbelievable. But at the same time, you knew it was true. "Well, what did you do? Did it get loose?" Leroy asked, not really certain of which of the multitude of questions to ask that was racing around in our brains at the time. "I shot the damn thing," he said matter-of-factly. He told us how he ran back into the house to retrieve his gun and how he was worried the thing would get away before he got it loaded. He was certain the thing would be gone by the time he got back out there, but it wasn't. It was still there, still yanking on the chain, still trying to get loose, and still as angry as ever about being caught. Jefferson described how the thing turned around and faced him, standing as tall as it could on its two legs, drawing in deep, anger-filled breaths. He raised the gun up to his shoulder and placed the creature's head square on top of the sight at the end of the barrel. A low growl began to rumble from the creature's throat, then it threw its head back and let out an ear-piercing howl that was silenced by the blast of the gun echoing through the night. Grandpa and Leroy just looked at each other as I sat there with my mouth hanging open. You could see the strain of holding back his emotions creep across old man Jefferson's face. His knuckles were white from gripping the rail on his porch, probably to keep his knees from buckling out from under him. Whatever that man saw and shot that night, it still had a hold of him, and it wasn't letting go. I know it sounds crazy, and I knew you wouldn't believe me. Hell, I'd question it too if I had heard it from one of y'all. I didn't plan on telling anybody, but after seeing that thing, that whatever it is, I had to tell someone. That's why I waited. That's why I didn't bury it yet, so you could see I was telling the truth. Leroy immediately stood up. Grandpa hesitated and looked at me. I knew what he was thinking. He didn't even have to say it. I nodded my head at him to let him know I was okay and that I wanted to see it too. We followed Mr. Jefferson out towards his barn, past the chicken coop where the incident took place. I scoured the pen with my eyes, but saw no signs of anything to confirm any of the story. Even though he was leading us to this thing's body, my mind was still trying to process what I had heard. It was almost like while I believed everything he said, I was expecting him to bust out laughing any moment or show us a dead coyote. I certainly wasn't expecting what I was about to see. We followed him into the barn. The air was hot and still at first, but then I started smelling a faint foul odor. Back by the back wall of the barn was a piece of sheet metal laying on the ground with some rocks on top of it, and a big pile of dirt next to it. Jefferson moved the rocks and pulled the sheet metal back and leaned it against the wall of the barn. The smell got stronger. The three men crowded around a square hole dug in the ground. At first, I couldn't see around them, so I pressed myself between my grandpa and Leroy. "My God, Jefferson, what kind of devil did you kill?" my grandpa said in a rattled voice. About the same time I peered down into the hole, Leroy lit his Zippo and held it over the opening in the ground. There it laid at the bottom of the shallow grave, just like Mr. Jefferson had described, only more than what I had imagined in my head. It wasn't a coyote standing on its hind legs. It wasn't some big old stray dog that had gone wild. It was exactly what he said. It was a monster. The thing had legs like a dog, only way more muscular and longer. The feet looked like what a dog would have, only much bigger and wider. The steel trap was still attached to its leg with the dried blood staining it. But unlike a dog or a wolf or anything like that, this thing had a waistline. Its hip bone jutted out just like a human. The body was covered in coarse black hair, no more than an inch or two long. It had an upper body more like a human than a dog, and it had shoulders like we do, albeit not as wide as ours, but they were there. One of its arms was folded across its stomach, and you could see its hand. It really was a hand, too, not a paw. The fingers were long and thin, with a black claw at the tip of each one. I could see the muscles of this thing's arms and on top of the hand. The neck was short and wide, and the head looked like that of a large wolf. The head almost seemed too big for the body. The creature's lips were peeled back, and you could see its teeth. Teeth designed for tearing up meat with long canines on top and bottom overlapping one another. The muzzle of the creature was wider and boxier looking than what a normal dog would have, with a broad black nose on the end that looked like it had some scars. One eye was gone, I assumed where the bullet had hit, but the other one was open and glossed over, solid black. The ears sat on top of the head, and they were pointed like a wolf would have, but seemed longer, or at least longer than any dog's ears I had seen. Between the heat, the smell, and the overwhelming emotions and thoughts of seeing this thing and hearing the story, my head started to swim, and it wasn't long before I was running out of the barn sick. After a minute or two, I regained my composure. Normally, my grandpa would have followed me out and made sure I was all right, asked me if I needed anything, but that day he didn't. I reluctantly walked back into the barn. The 3 men shoveled the loose dirt back into the hole, burying the dogman creature in the floor of Mr. Jefferson's barn. A while later, my grandpa was packing down the soil with the back of his shovel, and the piece of sheet metal was laid back over where the hole once was. I quietly walked back to my grandpa's truck and slid in the passenger seat, waiting for him to drive me home. We didn't talk much on the way back. In fact, he did all the talking. He explained to me that there are things in this world that man has yet to discover, and that thing was one of them. He told me that it was best we just kept what we saw and what we heard to ourselves, if nothing more than out of respect for Mr. Jefferson and the privacy he wished to keep. If word got out around town of this creature buried in Jefferson's barn, no telling what a fuss it would cause. Might even cost him his farm. I understood, and I never told anyone about it, not even my own friends. That was all years ago, and I'm a granddad myself these days, and those 3 men have been gone for a long time now. I moved out of the town eventually, escaped to the outside world, so to speak. The town is still there, but it's changed quite a bit. I'm not even sure who owns Jefferson's place anymore, or if that old barn is even standing. Werewolves, dogmen, rougarou, whatever you want to call it, they are real whether you want to believe it or not. Real enough that the image of that creature laying in the bottom of that hole still haunts me to this day. Makes you wonder what's making some of those howls out there in the woods late at night. It's probably just some coyotes or an old stray dog. Yeah, keep telling yourself that.